Welcome to Public Affairs. Tonight's guest is State Senator Barack Obama from the 13th Legislative District, State Senator from the 13th Legislative District. And we should say this show is being taped on July 13th, the year 2000, in Winnetka, and will show in a variety of venues at a variety of times. It will show throughout the city of Chicago cable system. It will show in about 13 suburbs on the North Shore and perhaps a number of other suburbs from as we get the show out to the hinterland. Let me start with just a brief introduction of our guest, State Senator Barack. And do we say Barack or Barack?
Yeah, Barack. Just like the Israeli Prime Minister.
Just like it. Okay.
Yeah, well, the same derivative.
Okay.
It's a Semitic word, means one who's blessed. In Hebrew, it's Baruch.
Okay.
Right.
Now, I had heard that you say that you got your name from your father and your accent from your mother.
That's right.
Because your father was from Kenya.
My father was from Kenya.
And your mother was
my mother was from Kansas.
And you were born in Hawaii.
I was born in Hawaii. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. Senator Obama was about 38 years old. We have that right?
Correct.
And attended school, a private school in Hawaii. Is that right?
Went to a prep school. Got a scholarship to a prep school in Hawaii. Went to Columbia University. Got my BA from there. Came to Chicago after college to become a community organizer and work in low-income communities out in the far south side of Chicago. Was a wonderful experience. After 3 years, went back to law school at Harvard, graduated in '91, and then came back to Chicago to pursue both a legal career and a political career.
Okay, but you're too modest, and you forgot to mention that you're the first African-American president of the Harvard Law Review.
I did pretty good at Harvard.
You did pretty good.
Did all right.
Should you say pretty good or pretty well?
Well, you know,
what's
you
the
know,
proper
when you're from Harvard, you don't want to speak too properly. The folks think you don't have the common touch.
There you go. Okay, and that's certainly something you do.
Yeah.
Talking about, as you said, you're 5 years of community organizing in Harlem for about a year.
You know, I organized in Harlem for about a year, working with programs that got young people involved in community development activities. Then worked out in the far south side of Chicago, some of Chicago's poorest communities, like Otgill Gardens, which is at the southernmost tip of the city. Worked
which is a part of the Chicago Housing Authority project?
Chicago Public Housing.
And I think the former director of the CHA was a former resident of that, Philip Jackson.
That's right.
A former guest on this show.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And so, tremendous amount of work to do there in terms of improving housing stock, working with the public schools out there, trying to create job training programs and youth programs. And it was a church-based organization, which I think is you know, in many low-income communities in not just Chicago but throughout the country are a very important base for activity. And so it was a wonderful education for me. And I really
was that an education? Let me interrupt. Was that an education for you as to the value of so-called church-based or faith-based institutions in the United States of America?
You know, I think both. I think a couple things that it taught me. When I got out of college, I think, like a lot of young people, you know, I assumed that if I was out there in about 5 years, I could turn the world around, and it's turning out to take a little bit longer.
A little longer. It might take 6 or 7 years.
Yeah, right. But I think one of the things that it taught me was that change, social change, particularly in low-income communities, is not an either-or equation. It's not just a matter of government programs. It's also a matter of attitudinal changes in the community. And I think churches, particularly in the African-American community, are a vital base, not only to mobilize political or economic power, but also to be able to transform people's own understanding of themselves and their relationship to each other. And I think that's an important recipe for success in any kind of social agenda that we have out here.
Now, but that's, you know, you are a Democrat. We should point that out with a capital D, and maybe a Democrat with a small d as well.
Both.
But, you know, I tend to hear, in terms of, say, our presidential candidates, that from George W. Bush talking about the value of faith-based institutions, and Republicans in general talk about how the government should not be so timid and shy in working with those entities to assist low-income people,
Right.
a variety of people in a
Right.
variety of ways.
Right.
It sounds like Democrats, if we can generalize, are much
Yeah.
more cautious on that they seem to have a reluctance to involve the government with church entities.
Well, I think
Am I right on that score?
Well, I think there are two things that are going on. One, I think the Democrats historically, at least if you look at Democratic activity in the African American community, is very comfortable with the idea that we need to work with churches. Those are important, vital institutions in the community. I think that there is hesitance on the part of a lot of Democrats, including myself, about entanglements with religion that potentially raise First Amendment issues. So I think in situations where potentially government funding to religious institutions gets entangled with religious indoctrination, then I think people have a concern. Now, the other major argument where I think a lot of this stuff comes up is that you'll have Republicans talk about faith-based institutions, George Bush Sr. as an example, as a replacement for, as opposed to a partner with, government. And I think that Democrats are suspicious of agendas that potentially lead to a dismantling of social welfare programs or defunding of social welfare programs, arguing that in fact voluntarism or the activities of private philanthropies can replace the important safety net that we've got from government. So I don't think it's an either-or question. I think it's a both-and strategy that has to be approached.
But if you could get back to your introduction in a second, but if you could take the funds that government spends on trying to assist low-income individuals and give them directly to faith-based institutions as well as other institutions, no change in spending, perhaps an increase.
Right.
In a sense, you have the institutional framework there, but you either have church-based, other volunteer organizations, private entities, if you will, doing this. Isn't that a plus?
I think
we're not cutting back on anything,
Right.
but we are allowing, and people would think, I would think that the faith-based institution, volunteer organizations are closer to the people in those local communities,
Right.
as opposed to coming downtown to the city of Chicago and dealing with the bureaucracy,
Right.
so they can help you on the south side of Chicago or in Waukegan or in North Chicago or wherever.
As I said, I think it's a both-and and not an either-or. I think that there are certain communities where the church is the only game in town, and you want to fund them for programs that are being run on a non-sectarian basis, whether it's daycare programs, youth programs. Some of the most vital, active institutions in my district are churches, and some of my closest allies are pastors who are working with me on various projects. But I think what you don't want to do is to say that the government doesn't have a role, because I think that government does have a role in terms of not only making sure that funding is available, but oftentimes government needs to be in place as the last resort. And I think a good example of that is the situation with the public schools. The Catholic schools do a wonderful job, religious schools do a wonderful job of educating a lot of children. But I think the parochial schools in this city, which has as strong a parochial school network as any place in the country, will admit that they couldn't accommodate the hundreds of thousands of children who are currently going to public schools in the area. And part of the reason they're able to do a good job is because they're dealing with a relatively small number of kids. So, I think that, it's hard to generalize across the board and say it's better to do a government program or it's better to do a church-based program. I think what you have to do is look on a case-by-case basis and say, who's doing a good job thinking creatively about solving the problems that exist in the community. And if they're doing a good job, then we should be putting money there. And if they're not doing a good job, then we should be defunding them, whether they're government-run or whether they're privately run.
Okay, well since you raised the issue of education, let's go there. But before we do, give our viewers who are in the city of Chicago or in the North Shore elsewhere,
Right.
if you could just outline briefly your district, the 13th legislative district that you represent as state senator.
The 13th legislative district is the sort of the mid-south portion of Chicago. And it stretches from the lake all the way almost to Midway Airport. It includes communities like Hyde Park, and so it has some very well-to-do and well-educated, stable communities. The University of Chicago, IIT, Chicago State are institutions that are either in or in close proximity to the district. But it also has some very impoverished communities. About a third of Englewood is in my district. It's got some terrific communities on the rebound like South Shore, but it's also got some communities that need real help. And so part of the challenge, but I think part of the interest of being a state senator for the 13th legislative district is you're dealing with a very diverse population base that is reflective of the diversity economically and to a lesser degree racially that exists in the city.
What would you say would be the most important issue if you had to come up with one issue for your residents in your district?
I think the number one long-term issue has to be preparing young people in the community to compete in a global high-tech dynamic economy. And so that includes education, but not just education in the public schools. It includes, how good of a job are we doing with early childhood education, how good of a job are we doing in terms of parenting, how good of a job are we doing in supervising our young people and giving them the values that they need to succeed in this economy. I think that what most parents and grandparents and community members worry most about in my community is, are young people sufficiently well educated and do they possess the values to be able to compete effectively in the economy? And I think that right now we're not doing as good of a job as we need to be on that score.
Well, let's cut right to the chase. Sure. Okay, I mean, there's a great debate, I think, raging through the country on education.
Right.
And we just had the National Education Association,
right,
National Association of Teachers meet in the city of Chicago last week. And what they clearly, I think, came up with, let me paraphrase it, was that is the vote of the union was there should be absolutely no relationship to how well a teacher is doing and that teacher's compensation, irrespective of how you assess that teacher. That is, the association was against measuring performance of teachers by the performance of students on standardized tests. They were against what their leadership was suggesting, which was measuring the performance of teachers by subjective, if you will, evaluations of their principal, superintendents of the students, portfolios.
Right.
And they said simply we should continue to do what we do, which is teachers are paid based on how many years they've taught and whether they have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or a PhD or somewhere in between.
Right.
Now, I got to ask you, Senator Barack or Obama, is that any way to run a railroad?
Couple things. Number one, the vote was close. And a vote like that wouldn't have even come up 4 years ago. So what I think it reveals is the teachers recognizing that the future requires them to professionalize and be measured and held accountable as professionals. Also to be compensated like professionals, which is a whole other question.
Almost a majority bought into what you just said.
Almost a majority bought in. Now, to me, I think that's a sign of progress. I'll be blunt. I think that teachers have to be accountable just like any other professional. And so I would have supported, I think, if I was a voter in that delegation, I would have voted for the leadership's recommendations. And I wouldn't be surprised if 4 years from now you see a different outcome. I think that the whole issue of how to measure performance of teachers is a legitimate concern on the part of union members. And then the reason is because, let's say, schools in the 13th legislative district, you have some schools where the children are coming to school extraordinarily ill-prepared. They don't know their ABCs, they don't know their colors, they don't know their numbers. They're already behind the first day they step into a school building. And for a teacher in that situation, even if they're doing a good job, to be measured in the same fashion, according to standardized tests, as children, let's say in Wilmette or Winnetka, who are obviously better prepared when they get to school, on average, is a difficult pill to swallow for a lot of teachers.
But that's not what anybody's suggesting. Let me just interject it. I mean, I think what people are suggesting is that, some people are suggesting anyway, people in the city of Chicago need to be measured relative to some improvement. And it doesn't say we're going to, because of all the factors you mentioned, we're going to expect a teacher with a student who's less prepared to compete with a parent and student who together are better prepared. Now, how do we assess that? How do we measure it? I mean, it's all very difficult unless you have a free market system in which people can make choices.
Well, now we're. I mean, that was a good segue into vouchers. But
There we go. That's a good segue into that.
So,
see, isn't that interesting? If I say the word choice, you see it's about vouchers.
no, but we can call it choice.
No, I'm saying there's nothing wrong with using the word. My point is that's how magical that word is.
Right.
And you know, I would think there is nothing. If I were running in your district,
Right.
and I knew nothing about it other than what you've just told me, and you just told me education is probably the most important issue, a little bit broadly mentioned than that, but that's what your residents are worried about. They want to know their kids can read, write, and perform in a global economy. And I said to them, gee, are you satisfied with how your public schools are performing? I think they would say no.
I think a large proportion.
A large proportion. And if I said to you, tell you what I'm going to do, okay? I respect you. I'm going to give you some choice. I think in your district, I bet altogether we spend per capita per student probably $6,000 to $7,000 on grade level K through 8, right?
Right.
I'm going to take all that money and I'm going to say, bring your kid over here. We're giving that kid a backpack and we're putting that $6,500 in the backpack. And you as a parent, on talking with whoever you want to talk to and talking with your child, can decide whether you want to continue to send your kid to that public school that he or she is going to now, to the parochial school down the road, or to all sorts of new schools that would emerge, just as we have in any free enterprise system when we're talking about production of shoes or production of computers, whatever. We don't know what will happen until consumer demand starts manifesting.
No, I understand the argument.
Okay, so now I just want to know. Let me just finish out, then your turn.
Okay.
Now I say to that resident, you get to choose. And I want, now a lot of people, as you say, their schools are performing, their public schools, they're doing fine, they stay at public school. The others are not. I want to know how that person is worse off in your district by having that choice. In fact, what I'm wondering, I mean, you're a bright guy, you were president of the Harvard Law Review, okay? You're at a good law firm here in the city of Chicago. The name of that law firm is?
Minor, Barnhill and Gallup.
Give them a plug too.
Sure.
You've written a book here, and not a lot of people, Dreams from My Father.
Right.
Dreams from My Father, a story of race and inheritance. This is written 1992, published in 95, Random House, from your Wilmette Library right here. Can we get a picture of that? Plug for the Wilmette Library as well. Here
I'm very happy that the Wilmette Library is carrying it.
Well reviewed in the New York Times. That's not always a good sign around this neck of the woods, but we'll give them that. Okay, so I mean this in a complimentary fashion.
Right.
My thinking is, if there is anybody who could glom onto the idea of vouchers, who could take it and run with it, and indeed we didn't mention that Senator Obama ran in the 1st Congressional District in the Democratic primary against Bobby Rush. Didn't win, but I think most people, especially in the Democratic Party, say this guy is at least the next Attorney General of the state of Illinois, perhaps the next mayor of the city of Chicago. So very, seriously, if anybody can understand these ideas, and they're not all as simple as I've condensed them to, articulate these ideas, and actually run with them as a political entrepreneur, I'm putting my chips on you.
Well, here's the problem. I think that we should have a serious discussion about vouchers. I'm not one of these people who says that you don't talk about issues of choice. I think you've got to have competition in the school system.
Okay, there you go.
I think you need competition in any field, right? If we're willing to deregulate in a whole range of areas, I think that we've got to think about how do we foster competition in the education system. What I would dispute, though, is the notion that if, in fact, we give a certain amount of money to everybody, that in fact there is suddenly going to be a bunch of suppliers who want to create schools for the hardest to educate kids, number one. I think that we have an example actually of choice or vouchers in public housing. It's called Section 8. And in fact, despite the fact that these Section 8 vouchers were out there, the supply of affordable housing in no way increased, partly because over time what happens with these choice programs is that people who are better off don't avail themselves of it, and they don't become particularly politically popular. I mean, one of the questions that you have to ask in a voucher program is, can I use the $65,000 to send my child to the top private school in the city? And if I do, why should I be getting a subsidy for me sending my child to a private school? You know, I can afford to supplement that. Whereas the public housing resident maybe can't avail themselves of that same school.
Wait a second, I just want to do it on a limited basis. I'm going to give all the residents in your district, and now you may say there are some residents who are high income and don't deserve it. If we could do a means test, that's easy to do. Those people don't get it, okay?
Which is being tried in Milwaukee, and the only question, I think the jury's still out on what's happening with the Milwaukee experiment. I think that one of the questions is whether you can sustain. See, the nice thing about the public schools is that to some degree everybody's bought in. It's like insurance systems. You don't segment out the elderly from the young, the people who are more prone to get sick from the people who are healthier. Everybody's in a common pool, and we say, you know what, this is a social good we're going to invest in.
But we don't, no, we can't let you get away with that.
Well, no, it's changing now.
No, but it's not like that at all. Here, in Winnetka, we spend $9,000 to $10,000 per kid. I don't think spending is everything, but I think it's important. In your neck of the woods, we'd probably estimate 60 to 70,000, 6 to 7,000. So, number one, it's not the same expenditure. Number two, the perks are different in Winnetka and Wilmette and Glencoe than they are there. The ability to attract teachers is very different.
I agree, and I want to change all those things because by changing the state funding formula.
But most importantly, here's what I want to do. Now, if somebody wants to improve their education and they live in the 13th district, they have to do one of several things. They have to scrape together funds on their own, forego the $6,500, go to a parochial school, which may cost $2,000 or $3,000, which isn't easy to come by.
I agree.
Or they could say, I'd like to go to Winnetka schools too. But guess what? Aside from the issue of paying that out-of-pocket tuition, they got to move up here. It's a lot harder for a variety of reasons for people to do that. On the other hand, under a voucher system, they could take that money, and if they want to supplement it, and some people have $2,500 to supplement it, and the public schools are competing, and that person wants to drive an hour a day to get an hour, to get here. They can do it. Why don't we want to? And they're not going to have to come to Winnetka. They can go to a variety of areas a lot closer where the schools may be better.
Assuming that the schools get created down there to supplement the public schools. Let me just say this. I think this is a legitimate debate to have. I think it's going to continue.
So you're open to the possibility you may become persuaded that vouchers are a good thing?
What I am persuaded by is that there are a bunch of creative ways, whether it's charters, creating competition within the schools, or thinking about tax programs that potentially facilitate low-income persons to exercise various options. I think all those things are on the table, and I think what we should be doing is what in fact is taking place right now, not just in Illinois but around the country. A lot of different experiments to see how in fact can we make sure that we've got better education.
But the Democratic Party, is unalterably opposed to vouchers. Al Gore, got the strong endorsement of the NEA, I think, right?
Yeah, he did.
And he did that because he is unalterably opposed to vouchers.
Well,
in short, Al Gore is in the pocket of the NEA.
Well,
you're not in the pocket of the NEA, or you couldn't say what you just said.
No, but I think that it's important, though, to engage the teachers, which I think, my sister is a public school teacher in New York City, and I think that there is not a single tougher job than being a teacher in a large urban system.
Absolutely.
And what we should be thinking about is how can we in fact engage those people who are in the classroom and on the front lines of this educational battle that we're fighting, and talk to them about how can we be more supportive, how can we provide them a better working environment to do their job. In exchange, how are they going to be willing to make themselves more accountable? Now, I think if you frame the conversation that way, then I think a lot of things get put on the table. If it's a matter of we want to dismantle the public schools and set up a voucher program versus then what happens is they dig in their heels, and their attitude is, well, these folks are just trying to get me fired or take my job or criticize me. And
we're trying to allow those. But your teacher, I don't know, but I guess if your sister's anything like you, she's a very good teacher.
She's an excellent teacher.
And she's going to benefit from a free market system that allows variation and compensation. That if she's got a tougher job than somebody else, she probably, and she's doing it well, she should be paid more. She isn't. She probably isn't now.
But that and that might not necessarily happen under a voucher system.
If free markets always compensate people who do better and deal with more difficult situations, don't you agree with that?
I don't think so.
You're a believer in free markets, right?
I'm a strong believer in free markets, but I think also that there are things called market failures. And I think what happens in...
Well, wait a second, you're on the south side of Chicago, the University of Chicago. There are no market failures there, right? You teach at the University of Chicago Law School.
But I don't necessarily agree with
You better not let any of your colleagues know you said the word market failures. Richard Epstein's going to have a conniption.
No, I tell you what, I think any economist will tell you that the market fails. And when the market fails, I think typically it fails in terms of providing goods, services to people who are disadvantaged in the economy, who don't have as many skills, communities that are more vulnerable politically and economically. And I think that what my suspicion is that in solving the education problems that exist in those communities, we are not going to have some magic wand solution like a voucher system in terms of solving the problems. But I know you've got a bunch of other things that you're interested in.
Well, we only have a few more minutes,
Right.
so one, I wish we could get to a bunch of other things.
Sure.
We'll get to one. I want to thank State Senator Barack Obama for coming here.
Thank you very much.
All the way up to Winnetka,
having
a long trip,
Yep.
and expressing your views and putting up with this tirade about vouchers.
No, it's
and we
no
hope
problem.
you're going to come back and do it, because we're not going to get to many more issues. But
Good.
well, let's get quickly to racial profiling. I know that's an issue. You've introduced some legislation in the
Right.
State Senate. I think you said it got watered down.
Yeah. It got watered down in the House. It didn't even get out of Rules Committee in the Senate. I think we're starting a conversation about my firm belief. I tend to be a real optimist about the American people, and I think that folks believe that the criminal justice system and the police should operate in a fair manner. And I think most people are not comfortable with the notion that somebody's judged simply on the basis of their color, as opposed to how their behavior. So, real simple bill essentially says, let's start collecting data out here so that we know why traffic stops are occurring, what are the reasons that police officers are implementing these traffic stops, so that if we have that data, we can examine whether in fact there are problems of racial profiling. If so, in what areas of the state is that occurring? And we have the possibility of actually solving this problem, which I think most people want to solve.
In your mind, should race ever be a factor in a policeman deciding when to stop somebody?
I think that if the police have a description of a suspect, that, for example, they say, we are looking for a 6'2" African-American male with a mustache and a tattoo. I think there's nothing wrong with them seeing an African-American male who's 6'2" and has a tattoo, and race becomes one descriptive factor among many in terms of stopping somebody. I think that when you have a situation where, for example, African-American males between a certain age are stopped based on the presumption or the likelihood